Thank you very much, Lorenzo, for the introduction, and thanks to Eumans for the invitation and for organizing this really, really impressive event, a very timely event, of course. I have to admit, it's really difficult to follow the last few speeches that we had, very sobering speeches, but I think Lorenzo said it perfectly in his introduction that democracy is the opposite of this, what we're seeing in this crisis. So it's even more important that we continue to reinforce democracy, as it's really the glue that's keeping Europe together. Indeed, I want to talk about three different points that Lorenzo mentioned. First, I want to talk about Europe's big experiment, big Citizens Assembly experiment. Maybe you've heard about it, at least if you're with Citizens Take Over Europe. I know you've heard about it enough, but maybe some of you will learn something new then today. Another point I want to bring up is how we can introduce Citizens Assemblies in already existing mechanisms of the EU. We'll hear from Michele later about a permanent EU Citizens Assembly, but maybe there are ways we can also introduce citizens' assemblies in already existing mechanisms in the EU. Those are things we can think about. And I also want to speak about the need for fundamental democratic reform in the EU, especially right now, given that this is no better time to really discuss the long-term democratic future of Europe. So first point about the big democratic experiment of the EU is, you know, and we've discussed already today and yesterday, there's this conference on the future of Europe, and one major point of it is the European Citizens Panels. And this is the first time at this level that citizens' assemblies by sortitions, randomly selected citizens, are selected to discuss, well, the future of Europe, really every topic under the sun. It's climate, it's democracy, it's migration, economy, jobs, social justice, it's everything, you name it. And they've been meeting since September until September of last year, until about a few weeks ago was when the last session met. There are 800 citizens, 800 across the EU. They're representative according to various categories. That's age, gender, member state that they come from, level of education or their financial level, and if they're from an urban area or a rural area. What's also interesting is that there's a big youth dimension in these panels, and 1/3 of these citizens panels, so 1/3 of those 800 are age 16 to 25. So you can really consider this kind of like a mini Europe that has started to discuss what direction Europe should go into. And this is still an ongoing process, so there's not much we can say about the outcomes right now, but it's already, I think, very interesting to see this experiment play out. There's a few highlights I want to mention, maybe some setbacks, because I think we should not really go into this too starry-eyed, that this is an experiment. We, of course, very much welcome it. We hope that EU continues with citizen assemblies. I mean, we're calling for a permanent European Citizens Assembly, but we should also be really clear about what the setbacks are, because if this experiment would happen again, those are things that definitely need to be addressed. So first, maybe starting with the good news. This is historic, as I mentioned. Never at this level has citizen assemblies been incorporated in EU consultations to this scale. That's not to say it's the first time sortition has been used in the EU. There was 2018, 2019, a consultation on the future of Europe, and that's where 100 randomly selected citizens were chosen to come to Brussels to put together a consultation, a list of questions that all citizens could take part in regarding the future of Europe. So it's not the first time that sortition is being experimented with, but definitely the first time that citizens' assemblies that are brought together across multiple weekends to discuss specific topics, they're given a specific task. That's the first time this is happening EU level. Also highlight is that it's, well, brave of the EU, I would say. We criticize a lot this process, but actually I would really say it's brave of the EU to invite citizens that represent all different political ideas, and they're basically saying, tell us what you like about Europe, what you don't like about Europe, we want to hear that too. So let me also just say maybe it's brave, and we should also recognize that. Also, no topics are off limits. This is different because that means we can now discuss topics of treaty change. That is something that, if you know, has kind of been like a Pandora's box in the EU. The last few years, you couldn't really utter the words treaty change. EU leaders would not really want to hear it, and that's something that suddenly is on the table again, and in the last few weeks, much more so. So citizens themselves can also develop recommendations. They can put proposals on the table that require treaty change, and it's very good. I would say we should very much welcome this, that we're able to expand the scope of how we discuss Europe. I would also say, as we don't know the outcomes yet, we should have a clear idea after May 9th. The lives have definitely been changed of these 800 citizens that have been selected. I monitored and observed the panel, European Citizens Panel number 2 on migration in Europe and the world, and I can tell you the citizens I met there are really amazed that this is happening. They've learned so much about the EU. They've made friendships. They're planning, even though let's say their mandate has ended at this point, they're planning trips to see each other. So friendships have definitely been created through this process, and I think that's also just a special human point that we shouldn't forget when we're talking about all the benefits, the many benefits of citizens' assemblies. Now maybe the not so good news, at least, well, let's say lessons learned, what we can learn if we want to go forward with citizens' assemblies in the EU, and I definitely think we should. We highly criticize what Citizens Take Over Europe and all of its member organizations that marginalized communities have not been involved in a real meaningful way as in the European citizens panels. There were these 5 criteria that I mentioned, but for example, I think it's the panel on Europe in the world and migration. It's really a shame that there was not many people with migrational backgrounds there. That's really a shame not to invite them in the room. So this is something to highly criticize. When we're talking about marginalized groups, that's also no EU residents were invited. So those who are also affected by EU policy live here but don't have EU citizenship, maybe not yet, maybe can't get it. They were not invited. And also no EU candidate countries. You can imagine, I mean, when we're discussing like Europe in the world, for example, and defense policy, that's like no Ukrainian citizens were there. And they are there now in Strasbourg, just giving a statement, but they were not an integral part of the European citizens panel. So you can see what some of the setbacks there are. Last couple maybe lessons learned, I would say, from this process. The way experts were chosen, it was really a one-sided argument on many of the points. We really criticized the way experts were chosen, and that also the way experts were involved, and towards the later part of the deliberations and discussions, experts were not really involved at all. So at some point, discussions were really not even totally based in fact, where it came to really like scientific questions like about climate, for example. The citizens really needed to rely on the experts to kind of fact check those discussions, and they were not really involved in that process. So that's something to criticize, to make sure that, of course, the level of debate is always based in fact. And then, of course, the quality of deliberation is really affected because there's so little time. I mean, you can imagine all these topics I just mentioned that is being discussed, really everything under the sun, and they only started in September, had just really across 3 weekends. They were broken up into different groups, but the citizens just met across 3 weekends to discuss this. So there were 4 panels. These 800 were broken into 4. But this is the time problem is something we've criticized from the very beginning. I'd also mention now, because it's really interesting for this debate, and Lorenzo just opened the floor for that, the recommendations that came out of the panel on EU in the world and migration. This was European Citizens Panel 4. They came up with 40 recommendations. What might be interesting for this discussion, I'll highlight 3 recommendations that they came up with. One was to reduce dependencies on oil imports. So this would be basically that they called for an expansion on alternative oil or energy sources, and investing also in other sustainable options like high-speed European train. So these are recommendations coming directly from the citizens. They also recommended an increase in European Union's sovereignty in its energy production. And they specifically mentioned also in case that there are authoritarian regimes that we should really distance ourselves from this. I mean, what this was is really basically we should not sell our soul to Putin just so we can, warm our houses in the winter. The third point is they called specifically for a joint armed forces of the EU. This would be for self-defense. So specifically, they mentioned not an aggressive military action, that this would be strictly prohibited. These points, I mean, this is the demand tomorrow at this demonstration. These are recommendations from the citizens directly. All this time and energy and money that the EU has placed into this participation process, and this is the recommendations that came out. So these cannot be ignored. It's not just that we're calling for them on the street, that we're calling for them in our conferences and our recommendations, but the citizens themselves that were invited to do this job has also called for these exact same things. So that's something the EU absolutely cannot ignore. I want to speak now. I'm not going to go into too much detail about why we need a permanent Citizens Assembly, because Michele will touch on that in the work that we'll be doing in Citizens Take Over Europe for that. But I want to mention why that would be even important, just as a first, maybe as an introduction to what Michele would say. I would say this is a good way, Citizens Assemblies are a good way to tackle the issues where there has not really been political bravery on. We can see that also in Ireland. It's kind of the gold standard for us. Maybe we'll hear from Martin more about the details of what happened in Ireland, the Citizens Assembly there, but the politicians were really, they didn't want to deal with the issue of getting rid of the ban on abortion in Catholic conservative Ireland. So they basically said, we'll have a citizens assembly on it. We'll give this question to the citizens, basically get the issue off our backs. But of course, then we know what the outcome of that was, and it led finally to the removing the ban on abortion. But this is a really great way why we can use citizens assemblies, is because where there's no political bravery, where politicians do not take a strong stance on issues that need to be taken and dealt with urgently, citizens can have that mandate and they can demand and recommend that. I would also say that we can introduce citizens' assemblies in some existing mechanisms that we already have. So you've heard already about the European Citizens Initiative, and I would say let's even think further about the European Citizens Initiative and how we can introduce citizens' assemblies in this process. One way of that would be a citizens' initiative review. The state of Oregon in the United States does this. This is basically where a citizens' assembly takes place on a successful ECI. So once you reach the 1 million signatures within 1 year, which is a requirement for a successful ECI, that you then a citizens' assembly would be triggered on that. And a good argument for this would be is that, well, 1 million signatures, 1 million citizens are not a majority, of course. It's people who obviously feel strongly about that issue and they've signed that. But what about surveying the general population? This is a good way to do that with a citizens' assembly because they are by nature representative. So it's a good way to kind of survey what does the general population think about it. They're a mirror of society is how you can consider it. Kind of the same idea, but other way around, is an ECI to trigger a citizens' assembly. So you can maybe think instead of a threshold of 1 million signatures in 1 year to get on the desk of the European Commission, that we could also have a lower threshold to have an ECI then that would trigger a citizens' assembly on the issue, so that then the general population would also give their thoughts on it. And that could also, all this is just pressure points, right, then on political leaders to take action. So it's just other avenues we can use to raise that pressure. Now I'd like to just come to the third point before I close up, and that is why do we even need a fundamental democratic reform? I mean, maybe I'm also just preaching to the choir here. Of course, we see that we have this experiment, we have this whole process with the conference on the future of Europe, with the European citizens panels as historic as they are, but they're really going to just be a Band-Aid to the really deep democratic problems that Europe faces, that we see even more so in the last few weeks that we are facing. We have not all the competencies we need in Europe to deal as a union. We are just coming out of a pandemic. Actually, we're still in a pandemic, not to forget, but we're dealing with this pandemic. We have health problems in the EU. There's no health crises. EU's coming to a stop right there. It's 27 different member states doing things in their own way. We have now crises right in our backyard right here, and we don't have defense competencies in the EU. We are reaching another wall. We're right at a stop. We're dealing already immediately. We see also the effects of the energy problems. What is this going to deal with our energy? I mean, thankfully we have spring right now. What's going to mean for the fall and winter when it starts getting much colder? There are no EU competencies on energy. It's 27 different member states. So again, we're reaching a wall. And these are all. Oh, can you hear me? Hello. Hello. Okay. Okay. So all these are just examples of the many points that we are just reaching a wall. We are just reaching a stop in Europe. We cannot really go deeper. We cannot really go further past the surface to think about a sustainable democratic Europe, because there's so many things in the Lisbon Treaty that are just blocking us. And not to reject the Lisbon Treaty, because it brought us the European Citizens Initiative, it brought us many great things, but I think now, 20 years after the fact, we can take a look at, okay, is Europe today really ready to deal with the 21st century? I don't think so. So we see it now more than ever. So, I mean, I would just say in conclusion, really, we should welcome all these attempts, Conference on the Future of Europe, European Citizens Panels, the European Citizens Initiative. We should do all of this. We should definitely welcome them. But in the end, we're going to need a really democratic reform of Europe. And my best suggestion how we could do that would be through a European Constitutional Convention. Not backdoor deals, not intransparent decisions like how things were made during the financial crisis. It can be very, very tricky, a very sliding slope that backdoor decisions are made in times of crisis, and we need Europe that's now proactive, not always reactive. Otherwise, we're just we're really going down that slope where these decisions are made intransparently. So we really need to review what are the rules of the game that we have in Europe. What are the treaties that we have? We need a constitutional convention that citizens are also invited to build. So we've done good work in Europe already, but I think there's more we could do too.